The couch cushions had surrendered long ago. They held the permanent impression of my body, a shallow grave in cheap foam and worn fabric. I stared at the wall opposite. It was a blank canvas of off-white paint, chipped near the baseboard. This was the ritual: to sit and to actively not think. To force the images away by focusing on the nothingness of the wall until the details of its imperfections became a temporary world, a refuge from the memories that buzzed like flies behind my eyes. The low, constant hum of the refrigerator was the only sound, a single sustained note in the hollow space of the apartment. Outside the window the city breathed, its distant sirens and the growl of traffic a language from another life. My life. A life that had ended on a rain-slicked highway. My gaze drifted downwards, tracing a hairline crack in the plaster that I hadn't noticed before. It snaked from the ceiling, a jagged, dark line that forked near the middle. My eyes followed it to the floor, and stopped. There was something there, on the polished wood of the floor, maybe 10 feet away. A small shape. A burst of color in the otherwise monochrome world of beige carpet and brown furniture. Pink. A bright bubblegum pink. I closed my eyes, squeezed them shut until spots of light danced behind my eyelids. Just tired. It's the lack of sleep. The stress. A ghost of a color conjured by a grieving mind. That's what it had to be. I had not brought anything pink into this apartment. This apartment was a monastery of gray and brown, a place scrubbed clean of joy. I kept my eyes closed for a full minute, counting the slow hums of the refrigerator. When I opened them again, I would look back at the wall. I would not look down. The wall was safe. The wall had no memories attached to it. But the command was weak, a whisper against a gale. My gaze fell, pulled by a gravity I couldn't fight. It was still there. Not a smudge of color. It had form, the distinct shape of a shoe. A child's shoe. A sandal, with a strap across the top. I felt a cold prickle start at the base of my neck. I shook my head, a small, tight motion. A trick of the light. A piece of trash blown in from the window I'd opened for a few minutes this afternoon. I would not give it power. I would not stand up. I would not walk over to it. I leaned my head back against the cushion and forced myself to look at the ceiling, at the bland, uninteresting texture, until the image of the pink shoe became a fading afterimage against the white paint. It would be gone in the morning. Hours bled into one another, the city's hum softened to a murmur. My throat was dry, my mouth tasted like dust. The need for water finally outweighed the inertia that had pinned me to the couch. I rose, my joints protesting with a quiet crackle. I kept my eyes fixed on the path to the small kitchen alcove, treating the center of the living room floor like a minefield. I filled a glass from the tap, the sound of the running water unnaturally loud. The water was cold against my teeth. I drank it all in 3 long swallows, my back to the room. For a moment, with the cold water sliding down my throat, things almost felt normal. A man, in his apartment, getting a drink of water late at night. Simple. Physical. Real. I turned around. The glass slipped from my fingers, hitting the thin rug with a dull thud instead of shattering. Water splashed across the floor. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. It was no longer near the wall. The pink sandal was now in the very center of the room, placed perfectly in the middle of the small, circular area rug. It was no longer a vague shape in the periphery. It was an exhibit. Placed. Positioned. As if waiting for me. My breath hitched. No, it's not possible. I did not do that. I walked in a straight line. I didn't go near it. The rational part of my brain was screaming, offering explanations. I must have kicked it without realizing. The floor must be slanted. A draft. But this explanation was a thin sheet of glass over a chasm of dread. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, I stepped out of the kitchen. Each footfall on the wood floor felt deliberate and loud. I stopped a few feet from the rug, my eyes locked on the sandal. It was exactly as I feared. Not just any sandal. It was hers. Lily's. The one with the cheap plastic gem glued to the front and the cartoon unicorn on the side, its eye worn away from being scraped on asphalt. I knew the scuff mark on the tiny rubber toe. I knew the way the Velcro strap was slightly frayed at the edge. I had bought them for her. I had knelt on the floor of a shoe store and fastened that same strap around her small ankle. The memory, sharp and violent, pierced through the fog. her laughter, the smell of the store's cheap leather, the weight of her small hand in mine. A wave of nausea washed over me. This was a violation, a desecration. My grief was my own, a private, sacred wound. For this piece of it to be here, in this sterile box, was an obscenity. An anger, cold and sharp, cut through the fear. Who would do this? The landlord? A neighbor with a sick sense of humor? But no one had a key except me. I had changed the locks myself. Clenching my jaw, I stalked forward, my mind set on one thing: getting it out. This thing did not belong here. I would not let it stay. I bent down, my fingers trembling slightly as they closed around the small shoe. It felt real. The worn rubber, the soft fabric of the strap. It was not a dream. I straightened up, turning toward the trash can in the kitchen. Selak. The sound was explosive. A sharp, metallic finality that echoed in the silent apartment. It came from the front door. It was the sound of a deadbolt being thrown. Not a lock being turned from the inside, but the heavy, definitive chunk of a bolt sliding into place from the outside. What the hell? The words were a ragged whisper. I dropped the sandal. It landed on the rug with a soft, insignificant puff. I lunged for the door, my mind racing. I grabbed the brass knob and twisted. Nothing. It didn't budge. I rattled it, my shoulder slamming against the wood. It was solid, immovable. My heart was a drum against my ribs. "Hey!" I yelled, my voice cracking. "Who's out there?" Silence. I pressed my eye to the peephole. I expected to see the dimly lit hallway, the faded floral wallpaper, the door to apartment 4B across the way. I saw nothing. Not darkness. Not the absence of light. It was a solid, featureless, profound black. A blackness that seemed to absorb the light from my own eye, a void that pushed back. I pulled away, a new kind of cold seeping into my bones. Panic set in, raw and electric. I scrambled for my phone, which I'd left on the small table by the couch. My fingers fumbled with the screen, swiping it on. I stabbed at the call icon. No service. Of course. The words mocked me from the top of the screen. I always had 2, sometimes 3 bars in here. I tried again. Nothing. The room, which had always felt sparse and empty, now felt like a sealed container. The air seemed too thick, heavy in my lungs. I was trapped. The hum of the refrigerator seemed to grow louder, more menacing. The walls felt closer. An animal instinct screamed at me to get out, but the door was a solid wall of steel and wood, the peephole a window into oblivion. I backed away from the door, my eyes darting around the room, searching for a threat, for a source. My back hit the cold plaster of the wall. I stayed there, pressed against it, trying to make my breathing quiet. The only sounds were the maddening hum of the refrigerator and the frantic thumping of blood in my ears. The world shrank to the dimensions of this single room. Then, the humming stopped. The sudden, total silence was more terrifying than any sound. It was a heavy blanket dropped over the world. I held my breath, straining my ears, listening for a footstep in the hall, a voice, anything. There was only the silence. A silence that listens. And in that profound quiet, I heard it. It came from the center of the room. From the rug. Zip. A small, intimate sound. A dry, rasping noise. The distinct, abrasive sound of a hook and loop fastener being pulled apart. The sound of the Velcro strap on Lily's sandal being opened. It sounded as if it happened right behind my ear. I froze. Every muscle in my body locked. A stream of ice-cold sweat traced a path down my spine. I did not dare to turn. I did not dare to breathe. My eyes were wide, staring at the opposite wall. But I wasn't seeing it. My entire consciousness was focused on the space directly behind me. A space that should have been empty. The smallness of the sound was its horror. It wasn't a roar or a scream. It was a gesture. A quiet, deliberate action. It implied a presence. Dexterous fingers. A mind that was patient. A mind that was playing with me. It was the sound of a game of hide-and-seek I didn't know I was playing. Time stretched, becoming thick and slow. How long I stood there, a statue of terror, I don't know. My lungs burned for air. The pressure in my chest was immense. I had to turn. I had to know. The not knowing was a separate torture, a blade twisting in my gut. Taking a shuddering breath that felt like swallowing sand, I willed my body to move. I pushed off the wall and spun around, a strangled cry dying in my throat. There was no one there. The room was the same. The couch, the table, the window showing the distant, uncaring lights of the city. For a giddy, disorienting second, relief washed over me. I'm losing my mind. That's all it is. It's just me. Then my eyes found the rug. The pink sandal was still there, lying on its side where I had dropped it. The Velcro strap was undone. It lay open, the white fuzzy part exposed, the small unicorn staring up at the ceiling. It was real. The sound was real. And beside it, on the dark wood of the floor, was a small, circular wet patch. A dark spot, no bigger than a quarter, soaking slowly into the grain. As if someone, kneeling there just a moment ago, had let a single drop fall. I did not sleep. The concept of sleep was a luxury from another lifetime. I remained on the floor of the main room, my back pressed to the wall, watching the door. I watched the pink sandal and the small, dark stain on the wood floor next to it. Hours passed. The distant glow of the city through the window shifted from orange to a deep, bruised purple, then to the thin, gray light of dawn. The light didn't bring relief. It only made the details of my prison clearer. The dust motes dancing in the sunbeams, the scuff marks on the floorboards, the sandal. Open, waiting. My body was a single, rigid ache. My throat was raw. Sometime before the sun rose, a new logic had taken root in the scorched earth of my mind. A simple, stark equation. There was someone else. They were here last night. They had a key, or they knew how to get in without one. They were playing a game. The deadbolt. The shoe. The sound. The quiet drop of moisture. It was a message. And the message was clear. I control this space. I control you. I needed to erase them. I needed to reclaim the room. The first act was mechanical. I stood up, my knees cracking like dry twigs. I walked to the center of the rug, picked up the sandal, and carried it to the kitchen. I did not look at it. I buried it at the very bottom of the trash can, covering it with an empty cereal box and old coffee grounds. Then, I found the cleaning supplies under the sink. A bottle of wood polish. A roll of paper towels. I went to the dark spot on the floor. It had soaked in, leaving a faint, circular watermark. I sprayed the cleaner directly onto it. The artificial lemon scent sharp in the air. I scrubbed. I scrubbed until my knuckles were white, and the muscles in my shoulder burned. I scrubbed until the spot was gone, replaced by the uniform, dull sheen of the polished wood. Good. That was good. Control. I kept going. A feverish energy took hold of me. I would clean the entire apartment. I would wipe away every trace of last night, every trace of them. I scrubbed the kitchen counters until they gleamed. I wiped down the refrigerator door, erasing my own fingerprints. I vacuumed the small rug. The roar of the machine. A welcome violence against the silence. It felt like I was sterilizing the scene of a crime. With every wipe of the cloth, with every pass of the vacuum, I was telling them, and myself, that this was my space. Mine. My work brought me towards the back of the apartment, near the short hallway that led to the single bedroom and the bathroom. I was on my hands and knees, wiping down the baseboards where they met the floor. The scent of lemon cleaner was thick in my nose. Then, through the chemical smell, something else threaded its way in. It was faint at first, barely there. A floral note. I stopped, my hand hovering over the wood trim. I drew in a slow breath through my mouth, then a careful one through my nose. Jasmine. I knew it instantly. It was the scent Clara had worn. Not a cheap spray, but the expensive oil she'd buy in a tiny bottle that would last her a year. She'd dab a single drop behind each ear. The scent wasn't just a smell. It was a key that unlocked 100 memories. Her head on the pillow next to mine. The way she'd tuck her hair behind her ear. The warmth of her neck when I'd lean in to kiss her. I pulled back, my heart giving a painful lurch. No. The word was a dry rasp. It had to be the neighbor. Apartment 4F. Sometimes their cooking smells drifted into the hall. Maybe she used a new air freshener. It was coming from under the door. That was the only explanation. I forced myself to accept it. I would not let them use this too. I would not let them take her from me in this way. I went back to scrubbing the baseboard with a renewed, savage focus. The motion was repetitive. The friction was real. The smell of lemon was real. The jasmine was just a ghost in the air. But it didn't fade. As I worked my way closer to the bedroom door, the scent grew stronger. It wasn't drifting from the hallway. It was clinging to the air right here. It was weaving itself into the scent of the cleaner, overpowering it. With every breath, it was a little more present, a little more defined. A cold dread began to pool in my stomach, chilling me from the inside out. My frantic cleaning slowed. I could feel my pulse, a heavy, deliberate beat in my neck. The scent was thickest right at the threshold of the bedroom. I got to my feet. I stared at the closed white door. The brass knob was tarnished. I knew what was in there. An empty bed. A bare mattress. An empty closet. An empty dresser. I had packed up all of her things myself weeks ago. I had driven them to a charity drop box in a town 3 counties over, so I would never have to see them again. The room was a hollowed-out shell. The smell was coming from inside. An anger, sharp and hot, sliced through the fear. This was different from the shoe. The shoe was Lily's, a symbol of innocence. This was Clara's. This was intimate. A line had been crossed. What is this? I muttered, my voice low and tight. What the hell is this? I grabbed the knob and pushed the door open. It was like opening a jar. The scent of jasmine rolled out in a wave. A powerful, concentrated cloud that hit me in the face. It was so strong it was almost suffocating. The sweet floral notes corrupted by an underlying, cloying heaviness. It wasn't the light, delicate scent I remembered. This was a gross exaggeration, a parody of it. It coated my tongue. It filled my lungs. The room was saturated with it. I threw it all out, I said. The words louder this time, directed at the empty room. My eyes scanned the space. The bed, neatly made with a single gray comforter. The bare walls. The window, locked, its blinds drawn tight. Nothing was out of place. It was exactly as I had left it. A tomb. Where was it coming from? John Fraze. I stormed in, rage pushing me forward. I was not a victim to be toyed with. Not with this. Not with her. I tore the comforter off the bed. Nothing. I dropped to my knees and looked underneath. Dust bunnies and darkness. I stood and yanked open the drawers of the dresser, one by one. Empty. 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 I was pulling at phantoms, fighting a war against a smell. I moved to the closet, sliding the door open with a loud rumble. Hangers. A few of my own shirts. Nothing else. I was standing there, breathing hard, staring into the dark, empty space of the closet, when it happened. Slam. The sound was a physical blow. The bedroom door crashed shut with the force of a detonation. The whole room seemed to shudder from the impact. A cloud of dust puffed from the top of the doorframe. The heavy, final sound of the lock mechanism clicking into place followed a half-second later. My head whipped around. I stared at the door, my mind blank for a full second. Then the adrenaline hit, a jolt of pure white-hot panic. I lunged, grabbing the knob and twisting. It was locked solid. I rattled it uselessly. Hey! A scream tore from my throat. Open the door! Open this fucking door! I pounded on the wood with my fist. Once. Twice. The impacts sent shocks of pain up my arm, but the door didn't give. It felt like I was hitting a wall of solid steel. The scent of jasmine, once a mere nuisance, now became the agent of my suffocation. It thickened, pressing in on me, and a strange coldness came with it, dropping the temperature in the room by several degrees. I could feel it on my skin. Then the light bulb in the ceiling fixture began to flicker. On, off, on, off. Each flashed through the room into stark relief for a split second, then plunged it into near blackness. On. The empty bed. Off. On. The bare walls. Off. On. My own frantic shadow, a dancing, disjointed monster thrown against the wall, my fist raised. The flickering wasn't random. It had a rhythm, a sick, stuttering pulse. The world became a series of still photographs of my own terror. Let me out! I screamed, my voice shredding. I backed away from the door, my chest heaving, my eyes darting around the strobing room. I was trapped. It was a box. A perfumed box, and the air was getting thin. In a flash of light, my eyes caught my reflection in the full-length mirror fixed to the closet door. I saw a man with wild eyes, his face pale and slick with sweat, his mouth open in a rictus of fear. The light went out. When it flashed back on, I wasn't alone in the mirror. A figure stood directly behind my reflection. It was tall and slender, wearing a simple white dress that glowed unnaturally in the strobing light. Long, dark hair covered its face, a solid sheet of blackness where features should have been. It just stood there, in the reflection, its posture unnervingly still. My breath caught in my throat. My scream died before it could form. My blood went cold. The light flickered off, plunging me into darkness with the knowledge of what was standing behind me. The figure in the mirror had not moved, but I saw its hand, pale, with long fingers, begin to lift. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace that was utterly horrifying. It was reaching for my shoulder. Off. I could feel it. I didn't see it, but I felt the air move, a cold disturbance just behind my neck. My skin broke out in 1,000 points of ice. The hand in the mirror was on my shoulder. It was just there, and through the fabric of my shirt I felt it. A spot of intense cold. A definite pressure. The weight of 5 fingers pressing into my muscle, claiming me. A sound finally broke from my lungs, a high, strangled shriek. Primal instinct took over. I spun around, my right arm swinging in a wild, blind arc, my fist clenched. I put all of my weight, all of my terror, into the blow. I aimed for the space where its head should be. My fist met nothing but air. The momentum of my swing threw me off balance. I stumbled forward, catching myself on the edge of the dresser. I whipped my head around the room, which was now steadily lit. The flickering had stopped. There was no one there. The room was empty. The door was shut. The bed was bare. I was alone. A ragged, desperate laugh escaped my lips. A hallucination. The stress. The smell. It wasn't real. It couldn't have been. I was losing my grip on reality, that's all. I stood there for a long time, my heart hammering against my ribs like it wanted out. My breathing came in ragged, painful gasps. Slowly, the terror began to subside, replaced by a trembling exhaustion. I leaned my head against the cool wood of the dresser, closing my eyes. After a minute, I straightened up. I had to see. I had to prove to myself that it was just my mind breaking. I turned back to the closet door, to the mirror. My reflection stared back at me, pale, terrified, alone. The figure behind me was gone. I let out a shaky breath of relief. It wasn't real. But my eyes drifted down to my shoulder in the reflection, to the spot on my gray t-shirt where the hand in the mirror had rested. There, pressed into the fabric, were 5 distinct indentations. They were clear and deep, like the marks left by fingers that had gripped with impossible strength. The material was creased and crushed into the shape of a hand, and from that one spot on my shirt, the scent of jasmine radiated with an intensity that burned my nostrils. It was the source. It was on me. It was on my clothes. It had been transferred by the touch of something that was no longer there. The bedroom door was not locked. It had never been locked. It pushed open with a soft click, a sound that felt impossibly small after the slam that had shut it. I stumbled out of the cloud of jasmine, my legs unsteady, my body humming with a poisonous energy. The air in the main room felt thin and sharp in my lungs. I stood in the center of the floor, gasping. My eyes darted from the front door, to the window, to the corners where the shadows were deepest. The room was the same. A box. A cage. My hand went to my shoulder, the one where the reflection's hand had rested. I didn't need to touch it. I could feel the cold spot through the fabric of the gray t-shirt. It was a patch of ice on my skin. I brought the collar of the shirt to my nose. The smell was there, thick and overwhelming. Jasmine. It clung to the cotton fibers, a sickening perfume that had been pressed into the material. The mark. The scent. Proof. This was not in my head. My mind was not breaking. It was worse than that. It was real. I collapsed onto the sofa, my body giving out. The springs groaned in protest. I needed a distraction. I needed noise. Anything to fill the space, to push back against the sound of my own ragged breathing. The remote was on the end table. I grabbed it, my fingers fumbling with the buttons. I aimed it at the small television set in the corner. The screen flashed to life. Not with a show, not with a news report, Just static. A blizzard of dancing black and white dots. The sound was a steady, abrasive hiss. Shh. Like the world's largest secret being told. It was ugly, but it was sound. It was a shield. I leaned my head back, closed my eyes, and let the noise wash over me. I tried to think of nothing. I focused on the hiss, on the feeling of the rough sofa fabric against my neck, on the lingering cold on my shoulder. I sat there for a long time. Minutes or an hour, I couldn't tell. The static was a constant, a harsh lullaby. My heartbeat slowly descended from a frantic hammering to a heavy, unsteady thump. The panic receded, leaving behind a residue of exhaustion and a raw, exposed nerve awareness. My eyes opened. I stared at the wall opposite the sofa. It was a flat, empty expanse of off-white paint, stained in places by years of neglect. The gray light from the window gave it a dead, institutional look. That's when I saw it. It was nothing. A thread. A single dark line on the paint, no thicker than a human hair. It started near the ceiling and ran down a few inches. I blinked. Just a crack. Old buildings settle. Plaster cracks. It meant nothing. I had 1,000 bigger problems than a hairline fracture in the wall. I looked away, back at the dancing static on the screen. Shh. But my eyes were pulled back. Against my will, I found myself studying the line again. It was just a crack. My brain supplied a dozen rational explanations. Temperature changes. The building's foundation shifting. Poor workmanship. I sighed. A long, weary exhalation of air. Just an old building, I heard myself whisper. The sound of my own voice was strange in the room, almost intrusive against the backdrop of the static. It was something to hold on to. A statement of fact. A flimsy anchor in a world that was coming apart. I would ignore it. It was a trivial thing. A meaningless flaw in the paint. I did not have the energy to care about it. My focus was on surviving the night, on surviving the next minute. A crack in the wall was not the enemy. I tried to watch the static again, to lose myself in the meaningless chaos of it. But the image of the line was burned into my vision. I saw it even when I looked at the screen. I closed my eyes, and it was there. A dark slash against the red of my eyelids. It was a splinter in my mind's eye. Something about it was wrong. Something about its placement, its existence right now, in this moment, felt deliberate. With a grunt, I pushed myself up from the sofa. My joints ached. I walked toward the wall, my bare feet silent on the floorboards. The hiss of the television seemed to get quieter as I moved away from it, the silence of the room rushing in to meet me. As I got closer, the crack resolved itself. It wasn't just a simple line. Now that I was standing a few feet away, I could see it more clearly. It didn't run straight. It began at a central point, a tiny, almost invisible pinprick in the paint, and branched out from there. 2, 3, then 4 smaller lines, spidering outwards in a jagged, asymmetrical starburst. My breath hitched. The muscles in my back went rigid. The sweat on my skin turned cold. I had seen this shape before. I had seen it an instant before my world ended. Etched in glass. Backlit by the flashing red and blue of emergency lights, the memory came unbidden. A high-speed collision in my own head. The slick black ribbon of road. The torrential rain. The sudden, blinding glare of headlights where they shouldn't be. The wrench of the steering wheel in my hands. The sickening lurch in my stomach. The explosive sound of metal on metal. And the instantaneous crystalline shattering of the windshield in front of me, spreading in this exact pattern. No! The word was a choked sound, a denial against the evidence in front of my face. No, it can't be. This was impossible. A coincidence. A trick of the light, a pattern my guilt-ridden mind was projecting onto a random flaw in the plaster. It had to be. I took the final step, my body moving as if in a trance. I had to touch it. I had to prove it was just a wall. My fingers, trembling, reached out. I had to feel the solid, unremarkable texture of painted plaster under my fingertips. My index finger made contact with the wall, right at the center of the branching cracks. The surface was smooth, cool, solid. There was no physical indentation, no raised edge. The crack was under the paint. Or maybe it was just a stain. a discoloration. I felt a surge of something like relief. It was an illusion. R-R-A-A-A-C-C-K. The sound was sharp and dry, like a large bone snapping cleanly in two. It didn't come from the wall, it came from inside it. It echoed in the small room, a violent percussive noise that made me flinch back. My finger was still on the wall, and I felt a vibration, a deep tremor that ran through the plaster and into the bones of my hand. My eyes, wide with shock, watched as the single crack I had touched erupted. Lines shot out from my fingertip across the entire surface of the wall. They moved with a horrifying, unnatural speed, branching and forking, creating an intricate web of fractures. The wall groaned, a low, structural complaint, as the web spread from floor to ceiling, from corner to corner. The room gave a slight, sickening lurch, like a ship hitting an unexpected wave. And with the sound, with the motion, came a smell. Faint at first, a chemical sharpness cutting through the stale air. It grew stronger with every second that the crack spread. A greasy, volatile odor that I knew as well as my own name. Gasoline. I scrambled backwards, falling over my own feet. I landed hard on the floor, the impact jarring my teeth. I kicked and pushed myself away, crab walking backwards until my back hit the opposite wall. The room was no longer a neutral space. It was the scene. It was a reconstruction. The smell of gasoline was thick now, an oily film that coated my tongue and burned in my nostrils. It was the smell of the end. The smell of fire and death. I pressed the heels of my hands into my nose, trying to block it out, trying to breathe air that wasn't tainted with it. But it was no use. The smell was everywhere. I stared at the shattered wall, my mind a blank slate of pure terror. The cracks had stopped spreading, leaving the entire surface looking like a giant broken eggshell. The hiss of the television was the only other sound, a constant, mocking counterpoint to the thunder of blood in my ears. This wasn't a memory anymore. The room was doing this. It was showing me, forcing me to relive it. Then, at the epicenter of the web, the point my finger had touched, the paint and plaster began to bulge. A small mound pushed outward from the wall, the fractured surface flaking away and dropping to the floor in a fine powder. Something dark was behind it, pressing its way through. It wasn't a creature, it was metal, dark, twisted, and scarred. It pushed further, the wall crumbling around it, the sound of grinding metal and crushed rock filling the air. Out of the center of my living room wall, the mangled, distorted head of a street lamp began to emerge. It was identical to the one we had hit. The green paint was scraped away in long gashes, revealing the dull gray metal beneath. The glass of the lamp was gone, replaced by a jagged, empty maw. It slid out of the wall with a slow, grinding finality, as if piercing the thin membrane between what was real and what was remembered. It stopped when about 2 feet of the pole had penetrated the room, hanging there in the air, a silent, impossible trophy. A raw scream was torn from my lungs. I was on my feet without knowing how, my body acting on pure, desperate impulse. My hand found the television remote on the floor beside me. I snatched it up and hurled it with all my strength. It was a useless, pathetic gesture of defiance. "Get out!" I shrieked. The remote flew through the air, a black plastic missile. It passed directly through the center of the ghostly lamppost, making no sound, causing no impact. It continued its trajectory and struck the wall behind the apparition with a loud, hollow thud. It clattered to the floor, inert. The projection remained, unmoved, unaffected. A solid piece of a nightmare, hovering in my apartment, stinking of gasoline. I stood there, panting, my legs trembling so badly I thought I would collapse. My eyes were locked on the impossible object. It didn't move. It just hung there. A quiet, final statement. This is what you did. This is where it happened. Then, as slowly as it had appeared, it began to retreat. The twisted metal pole slid backwards, withdrawing into the wall with the same grinding sound. The shattered plaster and paint seemed to pull back together in its wake. The web of cracks began to heal themselves, the dark lines shrinking and vanishing, pulling back towards the center. The process was silent now. Within 10 seconds the wall was whole again, smooth, off-white, and unbroken. As if it had never happened, the smell of gasoline began to fade, thinning out until it was just a faint trace in the air. And then it was gone completely. The room was as it had been. The only evidence of the event was the remote control lying on the floor beneath a perfectly intact wall. I stayed frozen for a long time, listening to the hissing static of the TV. My breathing was tortured. A slow, creeping numbness began to spread through my limbs. I finally lowered myself to the floor, my back against the sofa, my gaze fixed on the blank wall. My mind felt scoured, empty. I looked down at my hands. They were shaking. In the palm of my right hand, the one I had thrown the remote with, there was a small white fleck. It must have chipped off when I scrambled backwards. A tiny piece of paint from the baseboard. I brought it closer to my face, my vision blurry. I didn't need to get it close. It stank of gasoline. I remained on the floor, my back pressed against the sofa. For how long I don't know. The hiss from the television was a constant, a white noise that did nothing to scrub the events from my mind. The wall was a wall again, unbroken, blank. But I knew what it was. I knew what it could do. I opened my right hand. The small fleck of white paint was still there, a tiny island in the damp landscape of my palm. I lifted it. The smell was faint now, but it was there. Gasoline. Proof. The television hissed. The gray light from the window was beginning to fade. Another night was coming. I could not stay here. I could not let it do that to me again. The lamppost had been a statement. A demonstration. It was showing me its power, flexing a muscle I didn't know it had. The next demonstration would be worse. My body moved before my mind gave the order. A single clear thought cut through the fog of terror. Get out. Not run. Not panic. Just get out. A plan began to form. A simple, desperate sequence of actions. I would not let the room see me rush. I would not give it the satisfaction of my fear. I would act as if I were merely leaving for the day. I pushed myself to my feet. My joints protested with a series of small, dry clicks. I walked to the kitchen area, a small nook with a counter and a few empty cabinets. My movements were deliberate, measured. I found a canvas backpack I'd used once, years ago, hanging on a hook inside a closet door. I opened it. The inside smelled of dust and disuse. I went to the sink and filled a plastic water bottle. The sound of the water running was loud in the quiet apartment. I screwed the cap on tight. I found a single, foil-wrapped protein bar in the back of a drawer, its corners softened with age. I put it in the bag next to the water. It wasn't about survival. It was about the ritual. It was about acting like a person who had a destination. I zipped the bag shut and slung it over one shoulder. My keys were in a small bowl by the door. I picked them up. The metal felt cold and real in my hand. This was it. I stood before the front door, the final barrier. I took a breath, the air thin and tasting of dust. My hand reached for the doorknob. I ignored the faint tremor in my fingers. I was leaving. I was getting out. I turned the knob. It turned smoothly. I pulled the door toward me. It moved with a groan. Not the familiar click of the latch, or the soft whoosh of air. This was a low, resonant sound, a deep complaint of metal on metal. Scree. The sound of a rusted hinge, strained beyond its limit. The sound of a car door being pried open after years in a scrapyard. My hand froze on the knob. Old hinges, I muttered, the words feeling foreign and foolish in my mouth. My resolve was a thin shield, but it was all I had. The need to be gone, to be anywhere but here, was stronger than the new, unsettling sound. It was just a noise. I pulled the door open the rest of the way. The hallway was not my hallway. The faded floral wallpaper was gone. The worn brown carpet was gone. The door to Mrs. Gable's apartment across the hall was gone. I was staring into a corridor that had no right to be there. It was narrow, half the width of the one I knew. The walls were not plaster. They were sheets of bare, scarred metal, buckled in places as if from a great impact. Rivulets of dark moisture snaked down from a ceiling laced with exposed, weeping pipes. The floor was a grate of rusted iron, and through it, I could see only darkness. A single, bare bulb hung from a frayed wire 20 feet down the corridor, casting a weak, yellow, sickly light. The air that flowed out was cold and damp, carrying a smell of rust and stagnant water. My heart seized. A strangled noise caught in my throat. I slammed the door shut. The final thud echoed in my small room. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood, my breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. What the fuck? The question was a whisper. It wasn't possible. It was a trick. A vision, like the lamppost. I had to prove it. My hand, slick with sweat, gripped the knob again. I pulled. The same grating moan of tormented metal. Scree. I looked out. It was still there. The metal corridor. The dripping pipes. The dying yellow light. It was not a vision. It did not flicker or fade. It was solid. Real. The world outside my door had been replaced. The building, the city, the entire world I knew had been surgically excised, and this thing had been grafted in its place. And from the depths of that new reality, a sound began. It was faint at first, a rhythmic noise from far down the metal passage, past the yellow light. A slow, methodical grinding. Grind, chunk. Grind, chunk. It was the sound of immense pressure. The sound of a hydraulic press, of industrial machinery chewing through steel. It was the sound of a car being flattened in a compactor. With each grinding crunch, the bare bulb down the hall flickered. The light dimmed and brightened in time with the sound. Grind, chunk, flicker. Grind, chunk, flicker. It was getting louder. It was coming closer. The metallic grating under my feet began to vibrate, a low thrum that traveled up through the soles of my shoes and into my bones. Panic, cold and absolute, took over. I let go of the door and tried to slam it, but it was no longer a simple wooden door. It resisted, pushing back with an impossible weight. The wood felt hard and cold, dense as a slab of steel. I threw my shoulder against it, my feet scrabbling for purchase on the floorboards. The grinding was louder now, a deafening roar that filled the corridor. The flicker of the light was faster, more frantic, casting lurching, distorted shadows that writhed on the metal walls. Grindchunk, grindchunk. I gave one last, desperate shove. My shoulders screamed in protest. The door moved, groaning, scraping against its frame. It slammed shut with the heavy finality of a bank vault. The sound was cut off, muffled to a deep, vibrating rumble that I could still feel through the wood. I collapsed against it, my legs giving out. I slid down to the floor, my chest heaving, every muscle trembling. I was trapped. The cage was locked from the outside. The grinding continued, a monstrous heartbeat on the other side of the wall. It was right there. I could feel the vibrations through my spine. Then came a new sound. Shrriiiiek. A high-pitched, piercing scream of metal on metal, right on the other side of the door. It was a sound that set my teeth on edge. A sound that bypassed my ears and went straight to the nerves. It was the sound of a sharp piece of steel being dragged with immense force across a solid surface. It was scratching the door. I scrambled backwards, away from it, pushing myself with my hands and feet. Shrack. Another one. Longer this time. I watched, my eyes wide, as a thin line appeared on the door's surface. The white paint puckered and blistered, as if from intense heat, and a deep, dark gouge tore through the wood from the other side. It was a claw mark. 6 feet long. My hands flew to my ears, but it was useless. The sound was inside the room, inside my head. Shriek. R-R. R-R-R-I-I-I-P. Another gash appeared parallel to the first. Then another. The thing on the other side was clawing, systematically tearing the door apart to get to me. The wood groaned and splintered. Dust and paint chips fell to the floor. The entire door shuddered with each impact, its frame rattling in the wall. The grinding noise outside had stopped, replaced by this focused, furious assault. I curled into a ball on the floor, my back against the sofa. I squeezed my eyes shut. I couldn't watch. I could only listen. The tearing of wood, the shriek of the metal claws, the deep, guttural rumble of whatever was making them. A sound like an engine trying to turn over but flooded with mud and oil. The entire apartment vibrated, a resonating chamber of violence. This was it. This was the end. It was going to break through, and the metal corridor would flood my sanctuary, and the thing that made the noise would. It stopped. The silence was sudden. Total. The shrieking, the tearing, the rumbling, all of it vanished in an instant, The only sound was the rush of my own blood in my ears and the faint, mocking hiss of the television. I stayed curled on the floor, waiting. My muscles were locked, my body braced for the final crash, for the door to explode inwards. But nothing happened. 1 second passed. Then 5. Then 10. The silence held. It was a heavy, watchful silence. Slowly, shakily, I uncurled myself. I pushed myself into a sitting position, my eyes fixed on the door. It was a ruin. 4 deep, parallel gouges ran from top to bottom, the wood around them splintered and raw. But it was still standing. I swallowed, my throat dry and raw. I stayed perfectly still, listening. Not a sound, not a vibration. It was gone. My gaze drifted down from the savaged wood to the floor, to the small gap between the bottom of the door and the hardwood. Something was coming through. It wasn't a sound. It was a movement. A dark line, creeping out from under the door. A fluid. It was black and glossy, catching the dim light from the TV screen. It didn't spread like water. It moved with a slow, deliberate ooze like tar or spoiled cream. A single, thick tendril of it crept forward an inch. Then another. It was completely silent. It looked like motor oil. Old, used motor oil. A small puddle began to form on the floorboards. A dark, growing stain seeping into my home. The puddle of black fluid on the floorboards did not spread. It held its shape, a perfect, dark mirror reflecting the distorted static of the television screen. It looked thick. It smelled faintly of burnt metal and hot oil, a scent that dug its hooks deep into a part of my brain I kept locked away. I remained on the floor, my breath a hitch in my throat, watching it. It was an intrusion, a violation far more profound than the claw marks on the door. The thing outside had bled into my home. Then it moved. Not outward, but inward, reversing its course. The edge of the puddle receded, pulling back from the wood with a quiet, sucking motion. The single tendril that had led the charge drew back under the door, followed by the rest of the viscous mass. It flowed in reverse, a stain erasing itself until the last glossy drop vanished, leaving behind only a faintly damp, dark patch on the hardwood, as if it had never been there. The pressure in the room lifted. The presence on the other side of the door was gone. I stayed on the floor for another minute. Or maybe it was 10. Time had frayed at the edges. The only constants were the television's hiss and the frantic hammering in my ribcage. Eventually, the trembling in my limbs subsided to a low, persistent tremor. I had to get up. I couldn't stay cowering on the floor. That's how it wins. I used the sofa to pull myself to my feet. My muscles ached from the violent effort of holding the door, from the subsequent collapse. I surveyed the room. The savage door was the only evidence of the assault. A permanent, gaping wound in my reality. I turned away from it. I couldn't look at it. I began to pace. A caged animal in a space that was no longer a home, but an enclosure. From the sofa to the small kitchen nook, back to the window overlooking the dead street. Turn. 3 steps to the television. Turn. 4 steps to the wall beside the savage door. Turn again. The motion was mindless, a physical outlet for the panic that had nowhere else to go. My bare feet made soft, rhythmic padding sounds on the wood. It was a pattern, a circuit, a way to measure the dimensions of my prison. Sofa to kitchen, window to television, television to wall, again, and again. Something was wrong. My circuit felt off, shorter. I stopped mid-stride, halfway between the television and the wall. I held myself still, listening. The hiss of the screen was unchanged. The silence from outside was complete. It was a feeling, a spatial miscalculation. When I turned from the television, my shoulder had brushed against the arm of the sofa. It never did that. There was always at least a foot of clearance. "No," I whispered, the sound swallowed by the room. "You're just dizzy, panicked." I forced myself to sit down on the sofa. I pressed my back hard into the cushions, trying to ground myself in a familiar position. I stared at the television across the small living area. It was just a feeling. My mind was exhausted, playing tricks on me. The terror had warped my perception. That had to be it. I sat there, forcing my breathing to slow, commanding my body to relax. I would sit for 5 minutes. Then I would get up, and everything would be normal. The distances would be correct. The 5 minutes felt like an hour. Every second was a loud tick in my head. I focused on the gray static on the screen, letting it fill my vision. Finally, I pushed myself up. My legs felt stiff, tense. I walked to the kitchen nook, my eyes fixed on the countertop. I needed a glass of water. A simple task. An anchor. I filled a glass from the tap, my hand shaking so badly that water sloshed over the rim. I drank it all in 3 long, desperate swallows. The cold liquid did nothing to calm the fire in my nerves. I turned around, and the air left my lungs in a single, silent gasp. There was no more doubt. No more room for self-deception. The distance between the sofa and the television stand had shrunk. It wasn't a matter of inches, it was feet. Before, there had been a wide patch of open floor, the space I had just been pacing. Now, the coffee table between the 2 pieces of furniture was gone, not because it had moved, but because the space it occupied no longer existed. The sofa and the television stand were now separated by a narrow channel of floor no wider than a hallway. I could sit on the sofa and put my feet up on the stand. I could reach out and touch the dusty screen, without even leaning forward. It's getting smaller. The words were a statement of fact. A horrifying, impossible fact that bypassed all logic and hit me with the force of a physical blow. The anger, the defiance I had felt earlier, it all evaporated, replaced by a deep, cold dread that settled in my stomach like a stone. I wasn't just trapped, I was being crushed. My gaze darted around the room. The walls. I stared at the one nearest to me, the one separating the living area from the bathroom. I watched it. And I saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible movement. A slow, rhythmic inward bulging, like a chest inhaling. It would swell for a few seconds, hold, and then recede, but it never receded quite as far as it had been before. Each breath the room took, it claimed another fraction of an inch of my existence. The apartment was a living thing, and it was contracting around me. A strangled sound escaped my lips. I lurched away from the kitchen, stumbling into the shrinking living space. A low groaning sound started, the sound of immense, slow pressure. It came from all around me. It was the sound of plaster complaining, of wooden studs bending under a strain they were never meant to bear. The wall with the window was moving in. The wall behind the sofa was moving in. They were closing on me. A slow, methodical execution. Panic erupted. I scrambled for the bedroom, my only other refuge. I threw the door open and stared inside. It was happening there too. The bed frame was scraping against the encroaching wall, its headboard tilted at an unnatural angle. The small dresser on the opposite side was already touching the closet door, the wood of both surfaces creaking and popping. The room was a mess of displaced furniture, squeezed together by an invisible force. I backed out, slamming the door, as if that could contain the phenomenon. I turned to the bathroom. The door was wedged shut. I threw my shoulder against it, but it wouldn't budge. The frame had already been compressed, sealing it. I was back in the main room. The groaning was louder now, a constant chorus of structural torment. A picture frame on the wall opposite the sofa suddenly fell, the glass shattering on the floor. A line of fine dust trickled from the ceiling as it lowered, centimeter by centimeter. My sanctuary was becoming a vice, a trash compactor. No! The shout was thin, swallowed by the noise of the room dying around me. No, no, no! I was backed into the center of the remaining space. Now it was just a corridor. The sofa was jammed hard against the television. The kitchen counter was only a few feet from my back. The walls moved with a visible, undeniable certainty. I could see the paint cracking. I could see the drywall beginning to buckle and bubble. The small wooden coffee table, which I now saw had been pushed into the narrow space between the bedroom door and the advancing wall, became the center of the drama. It was a sturdy, simple thing. Oak. I watched as the wall pressed against its legs. The wood began to whine, a high-pitched sound of fibers being torn apart. One leg canted inward, then another. The tabletop began to bow upwards in the middle, the strain becoming unbearable. I was frozen, watching this small, mundane execution. The sound was explosive. Crack! It was louder than a gunshot. The tabletop snapped clean in half, the tension releasing in a violent burst. Wood fragments flew across the shrinking space like shrapnel. I flinched, throwing an arm up to protect my face, but I was too slow. Something sharp and hot slashed across my cheek. The pain was electric. It was real. It cut through the fog of impossible dread with its brutal, simple reality. A hot line of fire just below my eye. I reached up and my fingers came away wet. Not with oil. With my own blood. Warm and sticky. And in that moment something inside me broke. The fear didn't vanish, but it was consumed by a blast of pure, feral rage. The rage of a cornered thing. It was no longer just happening to me, it was being done to me. This thing, this room, it was actively trying to kill me, to pulp me into the floorboards. I spun to face the nearest wall, the one that had broken the table. It was only an arm's length away now, its surface rippling with the force of its advance. I saw the grain of the plaster, the small imperfections, the cracks spiderwebbing from the pressure. It was solid. It was real. I roared, a wordless sound torn from the bottom of my lungs. It wasn't a plea. It was a challenge. I launched myself forward and slammed my fist into the wall. My knuckles impacted the surface. It was hard, cold, unmoving as a slab of granite. Pain shot up my arm, but it was nothing compared to the rage burning in my chest. The wall didn't even slow. It continued its remorseless journey inward. Stop! The word tore from my throat, raw and desperate and furious all at once. It was the last bullet in an empty gun. A final, useless act of defiance against the inevitable. And for a single, heart-stopping moment, everything did. The groaning of the apartment ceased. The inward movement of the walls halted. My fist was still pressed against the cold plaster. Then came a sound I can only describe as a great, sudden intake of breath. A deep whoosh of displaced air, rushing from all directions at once. My eyes, wide with shock, saw the walls. All of them, snap backward. They didn't just recede. They flew back to their original positions in less than a second. The bookshelf righted itself with a loud thud, as its base settled flat on the floor. The kitchen counter was suddenly 10 feet away. The space between the sofa and the television reappeared, vast and empty. I stumbled forward into the newly created void, my legs weak, my head spun with a sudden, violent shift in perspective. I stood in the middle of my living room. It was exactly as it had been an hour ago. No, exactly as it had been yesterday. The shattered picture frame was back on the wall, its glass intact. The books were neat on their shelves. I looked toward the bedroom door. The coffee table sat beside it, whole and unharmed, its oak surface gleaming faintly in the light of the television. Not a scratch on it. It hadn't happened. My mind had finally, completely shattered. That was the only explanation. It was a hallucination, a waking nightmare of incredible intensity and detail. I brought a shaking hand up to my face to wipe away the sweat. My breath hitched, my cheek was still stinging. Slowly, I lowered my hand and looked at my fingertips. They were smeared with red. Fresh blood. A thin, warm trickle was running down my jaw, dripping onto the collar of my shirt. I could feel the open wound, a sharp, clean cut in my skin. The room was pristine. The damage was gone, but the scar remained. The blood on my fingertips was the only thing that felt certain. It was warm, slick, and undeniably mine. The cut on my cheek pulsed with a sharp, clean pain, a tiny anchor of reality in a world whose walls had just breathed. I stood frozen in the center of the restored room, my head spinning from the violent correction of space. The television hissed its gray noise. The coffee table, once splintered into shrapnel, sat beside the bedroom door without a single mark on its polished surface. It didn't happen. It couldn't have. But the blood was there. The sting was there. My feet moved on their own, carrying me past the sofa, across the unblemished floorboards, and into the bathroom. I flicked the light switch. The fluorescent bulb above the mirror hummed to life with a weak flicker, casting a pale, clinical glow on everything. I leaned over the sink, my knuckles white as I gripped the porcelain edge. In the mirror, a stranger stared back. His hair was wild, his eyes were wide, and a thin, precise line of red ran down his cheek, welling up from a cut just below his right eye. He looked hunted. He looked like he was losing his mind. I was losing my mind. I twisted the cold tap and splashed water on my face. The shock of it made me gasp. The water mingled with the blood, turning faintly pink as it swirled down the drain. I grabbed a piece of toilet paper and pressed it against the wound, holding it there as I stared at my own reflection. The man in the mirror was trembling. My defiance, that brief, furious roar against the crushing walls, had drained away, leaving behind a hollowed-out exhaustion. But there was something else, too. A tiny, hard kernel of knowledge. My scream had done something. I had pushed back, and for a second, it had worked. The room had obeyed. That's when I heard it. Drip. A single, metallic-sounding drop hitting a hard surface. I held my breath, listening. My own heartbeat thudded in my ears. The hum of the light. The hiss from the other room. Drip. It was coming from the sink, the faucet. I had just turned it off, but it must be loose. I reached out and tightened the chrome handle, turning it harder than necessary until my knuckles ached. The pressure of the toilet paper on my cheek was a dull, constant throb. I listened again. Silence. Of course. Just a leaky faucet. A normal problem in a normal apartment. I took a deep, shaky breath, trying to force the explanation down my own throat. I was afraid. Seeing things. Hearing things. The cut was probably from me stumbling in the dark earlier, catching my face on a corner. It had to be. Drip. The sound was clear, unmistakable. And it wasn't from the sink. My head snapped up. I scanned the small, tiled room. The sound was close. I looked at the shower head. It was dry. The toilet? Silent. My eyes drifted upwards. To the stained, white-painted ceiling. Nothing. No damp spot. No sign of a leak from the apartment above. My apartment was on the top floor. There was nothing above me but the roof. Drip. Drip. The rhythm was faster now. More insistent. And it was moving. I followed the sound out of the bathroom, my bare feet cold on the wood floor. The toilet paper was still pressed to my cheek. I stepped into the living area, and the sound was louder here. Central. I stopped. I lowered my hand from my face and looked. It was happening again. A drop of water formed in the empty air, about 7 feet off the ground, right in the middle of the room. It hung there for a second, a perfect, glistening teardrop reflecting the static of the TV screen, and then it fell. It struck the wooden floor with a soft tack and splattered. Another drop was already forming in its place. What the hell? The whisper was gone before it left my lips, swallowed by the sheer impossibility of what I was seeing. I took a hesitant step forward, my eyes locked on the spot in the air, where the drops were materializing from nothing. The ceiling above it was perfectly white, perfectly dry. There was no pipe. There was no source. It was just happening. Like a law of physics had been selectively suspended within the confines of my living room. I extended a trembling hand, palm up, into the path of the next drop. It formed, swelled, and fell. The impact on my skin was a shock. It was colder than tap water. Far colder. An icy pinprick that made me flinch. I brought my hand close to my face. The water didn't smell like chlorine or minerals. It smelled of wet asphalt and ozone. It smelled like a storm. It was rain, a single, repeating drop of rain, falling inside my apartment. Drip, 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 drip. The frequency accelerated. What was 1 drop became 2, then 5, then 10, all originating from that same patch of empty air. It was no longer a leak, it was a shower. The isolated sounds merged into a steady patter on the floorboards, a sound that bypassed my ears and drilled straight into my memory. I backed away, a cold terror creeping up my spine, far more profound than the fear of crushing walls. This was a different kind of violation. The walls contracting, that was a physical threat, brutal and direct. This was something else. It was an invasion of reality itself. The patter became a roar. Suddenly the phenomenon was no longer contained to the center of the room. It was everywhere. Water began to fall from the entire expanse of the ceiling. A torrential, impossible downpour erupted inside the apartment. It hammered down on the sofa, soaking the cushions instantly. It drummed against the television screen, the water streaking down the glass and pooling on the stand. It lashed against the windows, not from the outside, but from the inside, obscuring the view of the dead street below. The sound was deafening, a relentless pounding deluge that filled the space, drowning out the TV's hiss, drowning out my own thoughts. I stood in the middle of it, gasping, as freezing water plastered my shirt to my skin and ran in rivulets down my face. My hair was soaked in seconds. I was shivering, a deep, violent tremor that shook my entire frame. I stumbled towards the bedroom, seeking shelter, but the rain was just as heavy in there, hammering the bed, the dresser, the floor. The bathroom was the same, a waterfall cascading into the sink and onto the tiled floor. There was no escape. The entire apartment, my prison, had become a storm cloud, and the memory I kept locked away broke free. The smell of rain, the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the deluge, the glare of oncoming headlights reflecting on the wet black road. A blurry world of water and light and speed. The music on the radio, something soft that Sarah loved. Lily asleep in her car seat in the back, my hands on the wheel. A little too much wine at dinner, just a little. "I'm fine," I'd said. "It's only a few miles." The sound. A new sound, cutting through the roar of the indoor storm. A rhythmic mechanical squeal. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. My shivering stopped. I turned slowly, my waterlogged clothes heavy on my body. It was the sound of wipers. Windshield wipers. The sound was coming from directly in front of me, loud and clear and agonizingly familiar. Then, light. Two brilliant, blinding beams of white light cut through the downpour in the living room. They weren't coming from the apartment's fixtures. They were low to the ground, circular, and utterly alien. They swept across the room from left to right, illuminating the water-streaked walls, the drenched sofa, my own frozen form. They were headlights. They were right there. I threw my arms up to shield my eyes, but it was too late. The glare was absolute. I was a deer, caught and pinned. I took a stumbling step backward, my foot slipping on the slick, flooded floor. I went down hard. My head cracked against the saturated wood, the impact sending a starburst of pain through my skull. I landed in an inch of frigid water, the shock of it stealing my breath. I lay there, dizzy and disoriented, the roar of the rain in my ears. The headlights vanished. Darkness, streaked with falling water, returned. The sound changed. The roar of rain and the squeal of wipers were replaced by new noises. The high revving whine of an engine pushed beyond its limit. The horrifying screech of tires losing their grip on pavement. Then, a woman's voice, sharp with panic, screaming my name. "Michael!" And beneath it a child's cry. A sudden, terrified wail. Cut short. The symphony of the crash played out around me in the dark, wet room. A deep, concussive boom of metal striking metal, the brittle, explosive shattering of glass, a final, wrenching groan of a structure being torn apart. And then, nothing. The rain stopped. Not gradually, it just ceased. The deafening roar was gone, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like a physical pressure on my eardrums. The water on the floor vanished, sucked away into the wood with a faint receding hiss. One moment I was lying in a cold puddle. The next I was on a hard, dry surface. I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees, my head throbbing. My clothes were dripping, clinging to me like a second skin, ridiculously wet in a room that was now bone dry. The air was still and cool. I looked around. The sofa was dry. The television was silent and dark. The books sat on their shelves, undisturbed. It was just a room again. My room. I got to my feet, swaying. Water dripped from the hem of my shirt and the cuffs of my pants, forming small, dark spots on the floor. I was a living anomaly, the only wet thing in a dry world. The cut on my cheek had started bleeding again, a warm trickle down my jaw. I stared at the spot where I had fallen, where the impossible headlights had pinned me. I expected to see nothing, just the familiar grain of the hardwood floor. But there was something there, faint but clear. Two parallel lines, traced in moisture, darker than the surrounding wood. They started near the front door, curved slightly as they crossed the living area, and ended precisely where I had collapsed. They were damp, clinging to the floor, refusing to evaporate with the rest of the deluge. They were tire tracks. The water that dripped from me was an accusation. Each drop that fell from the cuff of my pants or the hem of my shirt struck the dry hardwood floor with a dark spreading stain. I was the source of the stain. I was the anomaly in my own quiet, contained world. The tire tracks, faint and damp, were a map of the room's violation, leading to the spot where I had fallen. My head throbbed, a dull pulsing beat that seemed to be coming from behind my eyes. I needed to get out of these clothes. The wet fabric was cold against my skin, a constant reminder of the deluge, of the headlights. I moved, my feet leaving damp prints on the floorboards. I walked through the living area, past the couch and the silent television, and into my bedroom. The air in here was still, the bed was made, everything was in its place. I stripped off the clinging shirt and sodden pants, letting them fall in a heap on the floor. I stood for a moment in the cool air, shivering. The cut on my cheek had opened again, a slow, warm trickle I could feel tracking a path down my jaw. The bathroom. I needed the bathroom. I stepped across the hall, my bare feet silent. The door was ajar. I pushed it open and stepped onto the small hexagonal tiles. They were cold. I flicked the light switch. The single bulb over the mirror flickered. Once, twice, then settled into a steady, sterile hum. I turned, my hand going to the medicine cabinet, my mind on autopilot. Find a bandage. Clean the cut. Do something normal. My eyes met my own in the mirror. I stopped. The man looking back at me was a stranger, pale. His hair was dark and matted with water. His eyes were wide, dark pools of something I didn't want to name. A line of red, stark against his white skin, ran from just under his right eye down his cheek. He looked like an animal that had been running for a long time. My intent to find a bandage dissolved. The blueprint for simple, normal action evaporated. I was compelled to just stand there, to look, to force myself to see what this place had made me. I leaned forward, my hands gripping the cool porcelain edges of the sink. My breath fogged a small patch of the glass. I stared into my own eyes, trying to find some piece of the man I was before. Before the room began to breathe. Before the rain fell indoors. That's when I saw it. A quick flash. A tiny starburst of light on my reflection's cheek, right beside the cut. It was gone as soon as it appeared, like a fleck of glitter catching the light. I blinked. I tilted my head, trying to replicate the angle, to catch it again. Nothing. It must have been a light bulb, I thought. A flicker. An odd reflection on the glass. My eyes were playing tricks. They had to be. I leaned closer, my nose almost touching the cool surface of the mirror. My focus shifted from my eyes to the skin of the man looking back at me. I wanted to see the cut up close, to assess the damage, and that's when the low, steady hum of the light fixture seemed to drop away. The sound of my own breathing ceased. The world narrowed to the few square inches of my face in the glass. There were lines. They were impossibly fine, like cracks in a porcelain doll's face. They webbed out from the cut under my reflection's eye, branching across its cheek, up towards its temple, down towards its jaw. They were like a spider's web rendered in hairline fractures. They weren't on the mirror. I knew they weren't. The rest of the glass, the reflection of the tiled wall behind me, was perfect. Unbroken. The cracks were on him, on the man in the mirror. My heart began a low, heavy drumming against my ribs. I lifted a trembling hand, my real hand, and slowly, deliberately, touched my own cheek. The skin was smooth. Damp from the phantom rain, but smooth. Unbroken. I ran my fingertips over the spot where the web of cracks should have been. Nothing. I looked back at the mirror. The cracks were still there. They were more defined now, clearer, as if they were growing deeper while I watched. A cold sweat, entirely different from the rainwater, prickled on my forehead. I backed away a single step, my hand falling from my face. My knuckles were white where they gripped the edge of the sink. It's not real. A flaw in the silvering of the mirror. An old mirror. That's all, but I knew it wasn't. I knew with a certainty that settled like a block of ice in my stomach. This was the room again. This was another lesson. Another piece of evidence. I couldn't look away. I was pinned by the image, a spectator to my own slow destruction. As I watched, one of the lines on my reflection's cheek seemed to darken, to widen, and from it a tiny dark red bead of blood welled up. It was a different wound from the actual cut. This one was spontaneous. It grew, became heavy, and then traced a new, thin line down his face, following the path of one of the fractures. Then another one appeared, near his temple, and another on his jaw. The man in the mirror was bleeding from a dozen tiny cuts that I did not have. His expression began to change. It was no longer just the panicked stare of a hunted animal. A deep, Profound pain was entering his eyes. And something else. Accusation. He was looking at me through the glass, and his eyes were asking a question I couldn't answer. A strange sensation started on my own face. A faint tingling. An itch. It was on my cheek, my temple, the line of my jaw. I had the sudden, maddening urge to scratch, to claw at my own skin. The tingling grew into a series of sharp, prickling points of feeling, perfectly mimicking the locations where the man in the mirror was bleeding. I resisted the urge to touch my face, convinced that if I did, my fingers would come away wet with my own blood. My breath came in shallow, sharp gasps. This was a new violation. It wasn't just changing the physics of the room, it was inside the glass, on my skin. It was rewriting me. The pain in my reflection's eyes intensified. His mouth, my mouth, tightened into a grimace. And then I saw something new. A glint, not of light, but of something solid, emerging from the skin of his cheek. It was a sliver of darkness, pushing its way out through a crack. It looked like a piece of glass. Another one appeared near his eye, sharp and wicked. The man in the mirror was not just cracking anymore. He was breaking apart from the inside, and the shrapnel was forcing its way out. His face was becoming a mask of blood and embedded fragments, a gruesome mosaic of my own features. My control snapped. This was too much. This was too intimate, too grotesque. But just as I was about to turn away, to run, the reflection moved. It wasn't mirroring me anymore. Its eyes widened in a final, awful agony. Its head drew back slightly, and then it lunged forward, slamming its face into the inside of the mirror with a sickening, muffled feel. The sound was heavy, fleshy, but the mirror did not break. It didn't even tremble. My reflection's head recoiled, its face now a ruin of blood and gore. Its mouth opened in a scream. I saw the muscles in its neck tense, its jaw unhinge, but there was no sound. An absolute, terrifying, silent scream that echoed in the small tiled room louder than any noise could. It screamed and pleaded and accused me from behind its unbreakable glass prison. I didn't think. I didn't plan. An animal sound tore from my own throat, a raw bark of pure terror and rage. No! My right fist flew. The world exploded in a cacophony of shattering glass. The sound was deafening, a sharp, crystalline roar that obliterated the silent scream. My fist plunged through the surface, through the image of the screaming face, into the dark void of the medicine cabinet behind it. A shower of silvered shards rained down into the sink and onto the floor. Pain. Blinding. Electric. It shot up my arm from my knuckles to my shoulder. It was a clean, vicious pain that cut through the fog of terror. I pulled my hand back, a gasp of agony escaping my lips. It was a wreck. My hand. Blood was pouring from it, not trickling. It ran in thick rivulets over my fingers, dripping in heavy drops onto the white porcelain of the sink, staining it instantly. The sink was already littered with jagged pieces of the mirror. I stared, panting at the torn flesh of my knuckles, the deep gashes across my fingers. Shards of glass, like tiny daggers, were embedded in the wounds. I stood there for a long moment, watching my own blood flow, the pain a strange, clarifying anger. The screaming man was gone. The cracks were gone. There was only the jagged hole in the wall, the shattered glass, and the throbbing, bleeding reality of my own hand. I brought my hand closer, trying to see through the blood. I needed to pull the larger pieces of glass out before they did more damage. My left hand, shaking, reached for the biggest shard stuck in the meat of my palm. I pinched the edge of it between my thumb and forefinger. It was slick with blood. As I pulled it free, I looked at it. I expected to see a thin, sharp piece of mirror, silvered on one side. But it wasn't. It was thick. Too thick. It had a faint greenish tint along its edge, and its surface wasn't flat. It was pebbled, broken into 100 tiny, non-sharp cubes that were still held together, a characteristic I recognized with a sudden, lurching sickness in the pit of my stomach. Another piece I plucked from my knuckles was the same. And another. It wasn't mirror glass, it was tempered safety glass, the kind used in a car's side windows. The shard of glass was heavy in my left hand. Its weight was wrong. My right hand throbbed, a deep, rhythmic beat that pulsed in time with my heart. Blood dripped from my knuckles into the sink, a steady, quiet drumming, each drop a dark bloom on the white porcelain. I stared at the thing I had pulled from my palm. Tempered glass. Pebbled. Thick. The kind of glass that shatters into 1,000 harmless cubes. Except these cubes were stuck in my flesh. Harmless was not the right word. My mind refused to connect the dots. It was a defense mechanism, a wall thrown up against a conclusion so monstrous it couldn't be allowed to form. Glass is glass. It breaks. I punched a mirror. It broke. My hand is full of glass. Simple. Cause and effect. But it was car glass. I dropped the piece. It clinked against the shattered remnants in the basin. I turned on the cold tap, the water hissing as it hit the porcelain. I thrust my bleeding hand under the stream. The shock of the cold was a clean, sharp pain. It was a good pain. A real pain. I watched the water turn pink, then red, as it swirled around my fingers, washing the blood down the drain. I had to get the rest of the glass out. I fumbled in the ruined medicine cabinet, my left hand clumsy, my right a useless, throbbing club. I found a roll of gauze and a bottle of rubbing alcohol. I didn't have tweezers. I would have to use my fingers. I sat on the edge of the bathtub, the cold of the porcelain seeping through my pants. The work was slow, agonizing. Each piece of glass I pulled from a cut sent a fresh wave of fire up my arm. The alcohol I poured over the wounds was a new kind of hell. I hissed through my teeth, my body trembling. I wrapped the gauze clumsily around my hand, again and again, until it was a thick, white bundle. It was already starting to darken with blood seeping through. I leaned back against the tiled wall, my head hitting the cool surface with a soft clack. The adrenaline was gone, leaving behind a deep, shaking exhaustion. My breath came in ragged sighs. The world seemed to tilt and spin. It started then. A tickle in my throat. I tried to swallow it away, but it persisted. It felt like a small feather, dancing just out of reach. It grew into an itch, then an irritation. I cleared my throat, a dry, rasping sound in the small room. It didn't help. A cough built in my chest, a small, tight knot of pressure. It came out as a single, dry bark. Then another. I pressed my good hand to my chest, as if I could hold it in. The air in here felt thick. Used up. That must be it. The dust from the broken mirror. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs unsteady. I needed water. In the kitchen, I leaned against the counter, my whole body shaking. I filled a glass from the tap, my bandaged hand a clumsy weight. I drank. The cool water, a brief relief. I rinsed my mouth, trying to wash away a taste that had appeared on my tongue. It was metallic, like old pennies, with an acrid undertone, like burnt rubber. I spat into the sink. The taste lingered. I stood there for a long time, just breathing. In. Out. A simple rhythm, the only thing that felt real. The throbbing in my hand. The cool tile under my bare feet. The hum of the refrigerator. Normal things. The pressure in my chest returned. This time it was not a tickle. It was a deep, insistent grip. A cough seized me. Not a small, dry bark, but a violent, racking spasm that bent me over the sink. It was as if my own lungs were trying to tear themselves free. It went on, a series of harsh, tearing sounds that stole my breath. I couldn't stop. I couldn't breathe in. Panic flared in my chest. I pounded my fist on the counter, a desperate, useless beat. When it finally subsided, I was left gasping, my eyes streaming with tears. I coughed one last time, a wet, final heave into the palm of my left hand. I sagged against the counter, waiting for my vision to clear. My whole body felt hollowed out. I looked down at my hand. My saliva was slick and clear, but it was streaked with red. Not a maybe, not a faint pink tinge. It was bright, fresh blood. A fine, crimson web suspended in the mucus. A new kind of fear settled over me, cold and heavy. This was different. The rain, the cracks in the mirror, the glass. That was the room. That was the thing that haunted this place. But this was inside me. This was my body failing. The blood wasn't an illusion. It was real. I could taste it. I could see it. My mind, so quick to leap to the impossible before, now latched on to the terrifyingly possible. Lung cancer. A tumor. An ulcer that had burst. I was sick. The stress. The lack of sleep. The constant terror. It had broken something inside me. The room wasn't the only thing trying to kill me. My own body had turned against itself. The fear was no longer of a presence in the corner of my eye, but of cells dividing, of tissue tearing inside my own chest. I was dying. Here. Alone in this apartment. The panic came back, a climbing, hysterical wave. I had to get out. I had to call for help. I stumbled toward the door, my legs weak, my bandaged hand held against my chest like a wounded bird. I didn't make it. The cough hit me again, with the force of a physical blow. It was a hurricane in my lungs, a convulsion that dropped me to my knees. My chest was on fire. I couldn't get any air. My body was trying to expel something solid that was lodged deep inside. I pitched forward, my hands hitting the floor, and I gagged, a final, guttural spasm tearing through me. Something hard and small shot from my mouth, hitting the inside of the kitchen sink with a sharp tink. I knelt there on the floor, panting, saliva and tears dripping onto the linoleum. My throat felt raw, scraped. I stayed there for a full minute, my mind a blank slate of shock. Then, slowly, I pulled myself up. I gripped the edge of the sink, my knuckles white. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely direct it. I reached for the faucet and turned on a thin stream of water. I washed away the blood and spit. The thing I had coughed up was revealed. It sat there, small and dark against the stainless steel. It wasn't just blood. It was a thick, dark clot, a congealed lump of my own life force. And wrapped within it, partially exposed, was a piece of black plastic. It was small, maybe half the size of my fingernail. It had a sharp, angled edge and a slightly textured surface. I stared. My breathing stopped. The sound of the water, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant noise of the city outside, it all faded away. There was only that object in the sink. I knew it. With a certainty that was colder and sharper than any fear I had felt before, I knew what it was. I had seen that same texture an hour before he died, when my fingers had traced the dashboard of the car. I had felt that same sharp edge on the shattered plastic of the center console after the impact. It was a piece of the car. My car. I had just coughed up a piece of the wreckage. The sickness I felt wasn't from a disease, it was from the accident. The accident was inside me. It was growing inside me, breaking me down from the inside out, piece by agonizing piece. The glass in my hand. The plastic in my lungs. It was all the same. The room wasn't just a prison, it was a stomach. And it was digesting me. Something inside my brain snapped. A wire that had been stretched taut for days finally broke. It wasn't despair. It wasn't fear. It was rage. A pure, white-hot fury. No. The word was a raw tear in the fabric of the apartment. I'm not going to let you do this to me. My eyes darted around the living room. They landed on the leg of the coffee table, the one I had broken 2 nights ago in another fit. It was lying by the couch. I lunged for it, my hand closing around the splintered wood. It felt good in my grip. Solid. Real. A weapon. What are you? I screamed at the walls, at the ceiling, at the silent, watching air. Show yourself! I swung the club. It connected with the wall next to the doorway with a tremendous crash, but the sound was wrong. There was no crack of plaster, no shower of white dust. There was a dull, metallic thump, deep and resonant, like hitting the fender of a truck with a bat. A large circular dent appeared in the wall, the paint crazed around the point of impact. I didn't hesitate. I swung again, this time at the floor. The wood didn't splinter. It didn't crack. It made a hollow, booming sound, the cheap, ugly sound of a large piece of plastic under stress. The floor buckled slightly under the blow. I was panting, grunting with each swing. The pain in my bandaged hand a distant, unimportant signal. I was destroying this place. I was tearing it apart. Or it was tearing me apart. It didn't matter. It was a fight. I stalked through the small apartment like a madman, a beast in a cage, smashing everything. The club hit the silent television, which didn't shatter, but caved in with a crunch of plastic and the tinkle of something small breaking inside. I brought the club down on the kitchen counter, and a piece of the laminate surface didn't chip off. It bent, leaving a white stress mark. I was not destroying an apartment. I was destroying something else. The sounds were all wrong. The feel of the impacts was all wrong. The air filled with the smell of my own sweat, blood, and something else. The faint chemical scent of hot oil and antifreeze. Finally, my energy spent, my arms burning, my lungs heaving, I swung one last time at the wall I had first struck. The club hit the same dent, but harder. This time, something gave way. A large section of the surface tore open, the white paint and texture peeling away like a cheap skin. I dropped the club. It clattered to the floor. I stood there, swaying, my chest rising and falling, and I stared at what I had done. I stared at what lay beneath the wall. It wasn't brick. It wasn't drywall or wood studs. It was a thick layer of soft, yellow foam. Spongy, pockmarked, and unmistakable. The kind of foam they use for insulation and sound dampening. The kind of foam that lines the inside of a car door. The splintered wood fell from my grip. It made a hollow clatter on the floor. I did not watch it. My eyes were fixed on the gash in the wall, the torn skin of paint and plaster revealing the yellow foam beneath. My arms burned. My lungs felt scraped raw. The rage that had filled me moments before drained away, leaving a vacuum. I swayed on my feet. The floor seemed to tilt under me. I slid down the wall I had just violated, my back scraping against the textured paint. My legs gave out and I ended up on the linoleum of the kitchen entryway, my body a heap of dead weight. The air was hot, thick with the smell of my own sweat and the plastic scent emanating from the wounds I had torn in the room. The cheap dome light on the ceiling seemed to hum louder, a single, insistent note. I was too hot. My shirt was soaked, clinging to my back and chest. With clumsy, exhausted movements, I pulled it off, tugging the damp cotton over my head. I threw it aside. It landed with a soft, wet slap. I leaned my head back against the wall. The cool surface, a small mercy against my feverish skin. I closed my eyes. I just wanted it to stop. The room, the memories, the air, my own breathing. I wanted all of it to just stop. A dull ache registered somewhere in my consciousness. A line of discomfort stretched diagonally across my chest. I probably pulled a muscle during my frantic assault on the walls. Or maybe I had just been lying on the floor in a way that twisted my body. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered beyond the simple misery of the moment. I focused on the feeling of my own pulse, a slow, heavy beat in my ears. The ache sharpened. It went from a dull complaint to a hot, insistent sting. A needle of pain tracing a path over my ribs. My eyes snapped open. I looked down. The faint reddish line I had half noticed before was no longer faint. It was a dark, angry welt. A band of bruised tissue, mottled with shades of deep red and a developing purple. It was stark against my pale skin. It started high on my left shoulder, sliced across my sternum, and ended near my right hip. A perfect, clean diagonal stripe. My good hand, my left hand, came up. I hesitated for a second, then touched it. The skin was hot to the touch, tight and inflamed. My fingers traced its path. It was a brand. A mark I had seen before, not on myself, but in driver's safety manuals. In news footage of crash survivors, the signature of a seatbelt locking hard against a human body during a moment of catastrophic impact. My hand fell away from my chest. I stared at the mark. The room had planted glass in my hand. It had fed me plastic from the dashboard. And now it was printing the evidence of the crash directly onto my skin. This wasn't a memory anymore. This was a recreation. Then the pressure began. It started subtly, a feeling of tightness along the bruised line, as if the skin itself was shrinking. I tried to take a deep breath, but my chest wouldn't fully expand. The tightness intensified. It was no longer skin deep. It felt like a band of iron was being drawn taut across my ribs, squeezing. Each breath became a shallow, difficult effort. I scrambled to sit up straight, my back leaving the wall. Panic began to prickle at the edges of the exhaustion. The pressure was real. I could feel my own ribs groaning under the strain. I clawed at my chest, my nails scraping my skin. There was nothing there. Just the hot, bruised flesh. The belt was invisible, but its force was undeniable. It was crushing me. The light in the kitchen flickered. Once. Twice. Then it went out. The persistent hum of the refrigerator motor died, plunging the apartment into a sudden shocking silence. The blackness was complete. I couldn't see the walls, the floor, my own hands in front of my face. But the pressure on my chest continued to build, a relentless, vice-like grip. My breaths were small, desperate gasps. I was being suffocated in the dark. A light cut through the black. It wasn't the lamp. It was a single, piercing beam, originating from somewhere low and to my left. It was a clean, white, blinding light. It hit the side of my face, making me flinch and throw a hand up to shield my eyes. The glare cast long, distorted shadows that danced on the wall behind me. I understood. The darkness, the single beam of light, the crushing pressure on my chest. This was it. This was the moment. The room wasn't just showing me the wreckage. It wasn't just feeding it to me. It was strapping me into the driver's seat. It was forcing me to live the impact, breath by stolen breath. My body had become part of the exhibit. The psychological torture had collapsed into the physical. I fought. I writhed on the floor, trying to squirm out from under the invisible restraint. I pushed against it with my hands, my muscles screaming in protest. It was like fighting water. There was nothing solid to push against, but the force was immense, unyielding. It squeezed harder. My vision began to swim. Little black specks danced in the blinding beam of light. My lungs burned. A grunt of pain and effort tore from my raw throat. This was how it would end. Not with a monster or a ghost, but with a reenactment. Digested by my own prison, crushed by the memory of my own failure. Something broke. Not a bone, not my spirit. Something deeper. A final dam of acceptance and despair giving way to a flood of pure, animal defiance. I would not die like this, not here, not again. No! The word was not a plea. It was a declaration of war. It was all the air I had left in my body expelled in a single explosive sound. Fueled by a final insane burst of adrenaline, I fought the pressure. I bent my knees, finding purchase on the slick floor. I put all my strength, all my will into one action, rising. I pushed against the invisible band. My muscles shrieked, my vision grayed at the edges. But I was moving. I was on one knee. Then two. I was standing, bent over, gasping, but I was standing. The front door. It was 10 feet away, an impossible distance. It was the only way out, my only target. I didn't think. I just acted. I lowered my good shoulder, the left one. I took one stumbling step, then another. It was a 3-step run in a tomb. I put every last ounce of my weight and my fury into the charge. I aimed for the center of the door, for the lock, for the handle. I hit it. The sound was not the crack of splintering wood I had made before. It was a violent, tearing screech of metal. A deafening pop, like a massive joint being dislocated. The entire door did not swing. It blew outwards, ripped clean from its frame. The force of the impact and the sudden release of pressure on my chest sent me flying forward. I sailed through the empty doorway. My body tumbled through the air. I instinctively braced for the impact, expecting the thin, rough carpet of the building's hallway. My hands and knees hit a surface that was nothing like carpet. It was hard. It was rough. It was wet. The impact scraped the skin from my palms and the knee of my pants. A shock of cold seeped through the fabric, biting and immediate. I was on my hands and knees, my head hanging low, my body shuddering with convulsive gasps as air flooded back into my tortured lungs. The air. It was different. It was cold and clean. It carried the scent of wet pine needles and damp earth. A fine, chilling mist settled on my bare back, on my face, in my hair. Slowly, shakily, I lifted my head. There was no dimly lit hallway. There were no numbered doors or scuffed baseboards. I was kneeling on dark, glistening asphalt. A yellow line was painted on it a few feet to my right. Towering black shapes of trees stood on either side. their branches skeletal against a starless, overcast sky. The fine mist was a light, steady rain. It pattered softly on the ground around me, a sound I hadn't heard from inside. I turned my head, my neck stiff. I looked back at where the door had been. There was no apartment. There was no doorway. There was the twisted, mangled frame of a car. My car. The driver's side door hung open, ripped from its hinges, sagging towards the ground. The space I had just fallen out of. I was on a road. The scrape of my skin on the road was the first thing. A raw, wet friction on my hands and my right knee. Cold seeped into the denim of my pants, a biting dampness that was shockingly real. I remained on all fours, head hung low, my body a collection of tremors. Air, clean and cold, flooded my lungs. It was an agonizing relief, each breath a sharp sting in a chest that felt bruised from the inside out. The air smelled of something other than plastic and sweat. It smelled of wet dirt, of pine, of rain. A fine mist cooled the bare skin of my back, clinging to my hair. Slowly, fighting a tremor in my arms, I pushed myself up. My muscles screamed. I rose to my feet, unsteady, swaying in the darkness. My world was a narrow patch of pavement and an immense, swallowing black. On either side of the road, trees stood as jagged silhouettes against a sky with no moon and no stars. A fine, persistent rain fell, making the surface of the road gleam like polished obsidian. A single yellow line, stark and bright in the gloom, ran down the center of the road. It seemed to stretch into infinity in both directions. I was out. I was free. The thought was a fragile thing, easily broken. A sound started, a faint crackle. It was a familiar sound, a broken whisper that had been the background score to my confinement. The hiss and pop of a radio struggling to find a signal. I turned my head, my neck muscles tight and sore, scanning the impenetrable wall of trees. There was nothing. No house, no other car, no source for the noise. It was just there, hanging in the cold air, a ghost of a sound. Where was it coming from? Was this another room? A bigger, colder, wetter version of the last one? The thought sent a jolt of ice through my veins. I forced myself to turn around, to look back at the place I had escaped, to face the doorway I had torn through. There was no apartment building, no hallway, no frame where a door used to be. My car was there, or what was left of it. It sat half on the shoulder, half on the road, a sculpture of ruin. The front end was an accordion of crushed metal, the hood forced upwards like a gaping mouth. The windshield was a shattered mosaic, 1,000 lines of fracture catching the non-existent light. The roof was bent downwards, caved in above the driver's seat. It was a violent, final thing, and the driver's side door, the one I had aimed my body at, hung open. It was ripped nearly off its hinges, sagging towards the asphalt. That was the doorway, the space I had just tumbled out of. The radio static crackled again, louder this time, coming directly from the mangled dashboard inside the wreck. A switch flipped in my head. A connection was made, so fast and brutal it buckled my knees. I put a hand against the wet, cold metal of the car's roof to steady myself. The room. It had never been a room. The couch I sat on, worn and sagging, it was the back seat of the car. The cheap linoleum floor, the car's floor mats, littered with old wrappers and dirt. The single humming light on the ceiling was the dim, pitiful dome light. The strange plastic smell I had tasted when I tore at the wall, that was the yellow foam insulation from inside the car's frame, exposed by the impact. The crack in the wall, the one shaped like a lightning bolt. It was still there, right in front of me, a spiderweb of broken safety glass on the windshield. Every detail, every torment, clicked into place. The constant, faint smell of gasoline, the sound of rain I could sometimes hear, muted, as if from a great distance. It was this rain. It had always been this rain. The pressure on my chest, the welt across my torso. It wasn't the room printing the memory on me. It was the memory of the seatbelt itself, the force of it holding my body in place, as the world tore itself apart. My prison wasn't a place. It was a moment, the last moment. And then I heard it. A new sound cutting through the rain and the static. A siren. It was far away, a rising and falling wail that echoed through the trees. It got closer. Louder, a pinprick of hope. So sharp it hurt. They were coming. Help was coming. Red and blue lights began to pulse against the wet trees, painting the scene in flashes of frantic color. The strobe hit the chrome trim, the shattered glass, the dark, wet road. The siren grew louder, closer, splitting the night air. They were almost here. Then something went wrong with time. The siren's pitch, which should have been dropping as it passed, began to climb back up. The sound stretched, became distorted, playing in reverse. The flashing lights that had illuminated the entire clearing began to shrink, their pulses slowing, receding back down the road they had come. They grew smaller and smaller, the reverse wail of the siren fading with them, until they were just a single point of light in the distance. Then they were gone. The night was dark and quiet again, except for the rain and the radio. They weren't coming. They had already been. I looked into the car, my eyes adjusted to the deep gloom inside the wreck. The darkness was not empty. I could make out shapes, vague forms, defined more by the space they occupied than by any clear outline. One was slumped forward in the passenger seat. Another, small, was in the back, directly behind me, and a third was collapsed over the steering wheel, right where I had been sitting moments before the pressure started. 3 figures. My wife, my daughter, and me. The air left my body in a single soundless gasp. It wasn't a realization. It was a confirmation of a truth I had refused to see. I had never survived. I had never woken up in the hospital. I had never moved into that sterile apartment. I had died here. In this car. This roadside purgatory. This loop of memory and metal was all that was left. I never escaped the crash. I never escaped the driver's seat. A force took hold of me. It was not a wind. It was not a hand. It was a pull, an immense and silent gravity emanating from the open door of the wreck. It was the weight of what I had done. A physical anchor. It latched onto the center of my being and began to drag me back. I resisted. I dug the heels of my shoes into the slick asphalt, my leg muscles locking, straining against the invisible tide. The rubber of my soles scraped against the rough surface, a futile grinding sound. The pull was immense. It was the universe correcting an error. I did not belong out here, on the road, in the rain. I belonged in there, in the wreckage. I was being reeled in. I tried to scream. I opened my mouth, a final desperate act of defiance. My jaw ached with the effort, but no sound came out. My throat was sealed. There was no air for a voice. The world began to warp. The tall trees, the dark sky, the yellow line on the road, it all began to smear and bend, converging on the single black rectangle of the open car door. It was a vortex, and I was at its edge, losing my grip. My feet slid on the pavement, 1 inch, then a foot. I was being pulled backward, inexorably, toward the driver's seat, toward the moment of impact, toward the reenactment. My body crossed the threshold of the broken door. The world snapped. The scent of pine and wet earth vanished, replaced by the smell of dust and stale air. The feeling of cold rain on my back was gone, replaced by the fabric of my t-shirt. I was not being dragged across asphalt. I was stumbling backward onto a worn beige carpet. I fell, landing hard on the floor of the apartment. My head hit the base of the sofa with a dull thud. For a long time I just lay there, breathing the dead air of the room. I was on my back, staring at the ceiling. The humming dome light was there. The walls were smooth and white, unmarked. I twisted my head. The front door was across the room. It was closed. The wood was solid, the lock intact. It was as if my desperate, violent escape had never happened. Slowly, painfully, I pulled myself up. I sat on the edge of the cheap sofa, the one that was not a car seat. I felt nothing. No fear. No anger. Just a profound, heavy exhaustion. It was over. The loop was over. And it had begun again. My gaze drifted across the floor. The carpet. The simple, empty space. My eyes stopped. Something was there. Something that wasn't there before. In the middle of the floor, sitting perfectly upright, was a single object. It was small. It was pink. It had a white rubber sole and a small, glittery strap. It was one of Lily's shoes.